start screening The Forgotten Refugees. It's a film about Jews from Arab lands who were expelled from Arab lands. And I think the film speaks for itself, so as we wait for more people to come, please get up, walk around, talk, enjoy the film. My name is Caitlin. I work at Boston University Hillel. I have been organizing this panel with Jennifer Susan in the back of the room in collaboration with scholars from Peace in the Middle East and Professor Richard Landis, who is unfortunately not able to be with us this evening. So we'll be starting at about 6:30, 6:40. We'll keep you updated, and thank you for coming.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. It means a lot to us. It was planned in a very short amount of time, and we're just amazed at the group that's here today. It means a lot to us. It means a lot to the Jewish community at Boston University, and the support that you give us. So tonight we're also going to light the Yom HaZikaron candle, as Yom HaZikaron has already started in Israel, as just a remembrance for the day.
And the Yom HaZikaron remembers the soldiers who fought for Israel, and today we fight our own war against the academia who is trying to destroy Israel's image. So that's kind of what this event is about. So yeah, thank you for coming, everyone.
Very excited for the situation to begin. Thank you.
tech folks are working things out. Thank you very much for coming this evening. We've had some unfortunate and sadly tragic events that's prevented one of our panelists from attending tonight. Dr. Landis' mother died. thoughts are with her. And Asaf Romarowski is at the airport now after 4 hours in the Philadelphia airport. So he's doing his best to get here and will be. Thank you for coming. My name is Richard Cravatts. I'm president of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, who, with the help of BU's Hillel, has put this event together. As you probably know, this event was planned as a counter-argument to a recent Right of Return conference that was held at BU. Scholars for Peace in the Middle East is an organization with 40,000 faculty members on 3,200 campuses around the world. And our objective and our mission is to end the bias and the contortion of scholarship on campuses so that university professors and supposed academic events are not mounted, which have as their sole purpose to write a false version of history, and particularly in respect to the Middle East, and particularly in respect to promulgating the myths, contortions, libels, and slanders about Israel. So that when Harvard University has a single state solution conference last April to decide whether it's a good idea to dismantle the Jewish state by having a binational state flooded with millions of Arabs who have been taught since birth to hate Israel and want to destroy it, every one of the 19 speakers is an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-American activist whose sole agenda is to demonize the Jewish state. So Scholars for Peace in the Middle East takes on the role of questioning those kinds of activities. We question professors who use their positions in the classrooms to promote bias against Israel, to teach a contorted version of history. Many of you are probably familiar with the writer in Britain, Melanie Phillips. She's a very courageous commentator, a brilliant commentator on what's going on in the world. And her latest book, I love to mention when I give my speeches on Campus Anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, it's called The World Turned Upside Down. And nowhere is that more evident than in our universities, where facts are turned on their head. In Britain, Melanie Phillips talks about the coming of Sharia law to Britain, the giving up of Western values, how the story of Israel itself is so turned on its head that many of us in this room were alive when Israel was founded, and yet facts are being told about history that are completely false. This is the world turned upside down, where Israel is accused of being a racist state, yet in the West Bank, an Arab will get the death penalty for selling land to a Jew. This is the world turned upside down, where Mahmoud Abbas says that there will not be one Jew allowed to live in the new Palestinian state, and yet Israel is accused of being a colonial oppressor, an ethnic cleanser, a Zionist racist regime. This is the world turned upside down. So that when a conference is mounted at BU to discuss the right of return, you have to ask some basic questions, which we're going to try to answer tonight. Why is it that out of 100 million refugees since World War II alone, 100 million refugees, only one set of refugees has never been resettled into other countries? Why is that? Who are those people? Those 5 to 8 million unsettled refugees who have been made to languish in refugee camps, not because there's no place that will take them, but because they're used as a bludgeon against Israel, as a way to continuously point to the state of Israel and say, you are responsible for the plight of the Palestinian refugees. Why is it that one UN agency, which Asaf Romarowski will talk about tonight, has been set up with the sole purpose of perpetrating and perpetuating the state of these homeless, stateless Palestinian refugees, who continuously claim to have what they call a sacred right of return. That right of return has no basis in law or fact, which we'll discuss tonight. We're very fortunate this evening to have a gifted panel of experts at different aspects of this argument, some of whom will counter some of the arguments made at the conference that was held on the right of return a few weeks ago. Some of them will share with you their insight about the general legality and state of the Palestinian refugees, how they became refugees, and in the context of the other set of 800,000 or 900,000 refugees from Arab lands who were Jews, who no one ever talks about. You know, Pat, I submitted a paper to the Right of Return conference 2 weeks ago, and in it I said, you know, at about the same time Israel was being formed, another state was being formed, Pakistan. Millions of Hindus were expelled and murdered to create Pakistan as a Muslim Islamic state. No one's calling for the Hindu right of return. There's over 600 religious sites that are sacred to Hindus in Pakistan. They're not allowed to visit them, to pray to them, to honor them. They're a dispossessed minority that are treated like animals. But no one's calling for a Hindu right of return. And this idea that a right of return is somehow passed down to the descendants of the original refugees has never before been recognized in any kind of international law. It's only assigned as a right given to the Palestinians. Why is that? Because the enemy of the Palestinian cause is the existence of Israel. And the right of return is nothing more than a technique, as Ephraim Karsh put it, to demographically subvert Israel by wiping out the Jewish identity and indeed the existence of the Jewish state by flooding it with millions of people who wish it to go away. You know very well in this room that the issue is not whether the borders are on the 67 lines or on the 48 lines. The issue is that the Jewish state exists. This is not about land. Israel is 8,000 square miles. The Arab world is 1.5 million square miles. 8,000 square miles, 1.5 million. This is not about land. This is about the existence of a Jewish autonomous sovereign nation. And so the Palestinian right of return has to be seen as part of the cognitive war against Israel, which my colleague Richard Landis likes to frame it as. We're joined tonight by Benny Morris, who will be talking briefly and soon about the general status of the refugees, how they came to be, what are the legal ramifications of it. Ben Dror Yamini, who will be talking about the Palestinian refugees, and Benny will also be answering some of the claims raised by Joseph Mossad of Columbia University, who was one of the keynote speakers at the Right of Return Conference. Asaf Romarowski is an expert on the United Nations Workers Relief Agency, which, as I mentioned, is the agency that controls and perpetrates this fraud of this category of refugee that the world has never seen, only in the case of the Palestinians. I think that I will turn it over to Ben. And thank you, and thank you all for coming.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for coming. Now you hear me?
No.
You hear me? Now it's okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening. Let me begin with a story. Some years ago, I read an article.
Can't hear you.
Some years ago,
Just move it.
just a minute. Some years ago, I read an article. The article was published by Professor Ilan Pape. I guess the name is familiar to some of you. In the article declares, 1. Transfer is the official moral option recommended by the IDC. IDC is the International Disciplinary Center, which is an academic institution in Israel. 1. 2. Transfer proposed by senior Labour Party ministers to the government. 3. Transfer is openly advocated by professors and media commentators. 4. Very few in Israel dare to condemn it. Well, I guess some of you know the Israeli society. We are not talking about an article. We are talking about one man that is dedicated to one thing: lies against Israel. The IDC never adopted the transfer. It cannot even be, because academic institution in Israel is not adopting any kind of political view. The Labour Party, of course, never adopted something of the kind. Ministers from the Labour Party never proposed something of the kind to the government. Every sentence in that article was a lie. And I was amazed. I was amazed because for myself, for many years, I was part of what you might call the peace camp in Israel. I was an activist. Many years ago, 20 years ago, I went all the way to Tunisia to meet Yasser Arafat in order to listen, to understand, to communicate, to promote peace. But unfortunately, I could hear so many lies that it was just unbearable. The turning point was, actually for myself, the Berlin Conference, more than 10 years ago. It was the UN Conference against racism and all forms of discrimination, but it turned to be a festival of hatred against Israel. I asked a lot of my friends, we are striving for peace. What have you done? I did not receive good answers. And it kept on and on. The story of the right of return is the highlight of the industry. Because actually, in many ways, they manipulated the issue. That became not the way to peace, but the biggest obstacle to any kind of peace. Right of return, the meaning of the right of return is the destruction of Israel. There is no other explanation. And they say it by themselves. But let's look at what happened in other parts of the world. It was already mentioned. Just some slides in order to understand what we are talking about. India, Pakistan, that was mentioned. We are talking about 40 million people. Balkans altogether since 1912 up to 1995, Yugoslavia war. We are speaking about 7 million people that were forced out of their homelands. Germans, ethnic Germans, immediately after the Second World War, we are talking about more than 12 million people. Not all of them were Nazis, but they paid the price. Let's go on. Karelia was part of Finland. About 500,000 people were forced out from their homeland. Let's go on. Georgia. We are talking about 300,000 people. Armenia, Azerbaijan. Because of the Nagorno-Karabakh, we are talking again about more than 1 million people that were forced out of their homelands. Cyprus. We are talking about 250,000 people 74 that were forced out of their homelands. It's not all the list, it's only some examples. Now let's talk about the norms of that time. Fridtjof Nansen received Nobel Prize because of organizing and carrying out population exchange between Turkey and Greece. Let's go on. Winston Churchill, in 1944, he said, expulsion is the method which will be the most satisfactory and lasting. There will be no mixture of populations to cause endless trouble. A clean sweep will be made. I'm not allowed by these consequences. It was the norm. Potsdam Agreement, 1945. The transfer of German population to Germany, remaining in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary will have to be undertaken. Again, it was the norm. We are talking about the 40s. Let me show you this man. I guess some of you know him. Professor John Mearsheimer, Chicago University. He is the co-author of the book The Israeli Lobby and the U.S. Foreign Policy. Ethnically homogeneous state must be created. That's what he wrote. Creating homogeneous states would require drawing new borders and transferring populations. He spoke about Yugoslavia. It was his opinion. But look at the same man. 2 years ago, in a memorial day for the Nakba. The Nakba is one of the great crimes of modern history. But how can you recommend transfers of populations from one hand and to claim that the Nakba is one of the great crimes of the modern history? I did something very simple because I'm also a journalist. I sent him an email. I asked him, dear Professor Mearsheimer, can you explain it according to what parameters did you decide that the Nakba is one of the great crimes of the modern history? You can guess that he never answered me. Let's go on. Only in Europe, only after 45, we are speaking about more than 20 million people that were forced out. But we have to understand the background of what happened in 47, 48, 49. Arab League, it was decided upon in 2 meetings that took place before the partition resolution. Before, all Jews were to be considered members of the Jewish minority state of Palestine. Their bank accounts would be used to finance assistance to Zionist ambition in Palestine, and so on and so on. The persecution of Jews was the official policy of the Arab states. Let's go on. Hitler, I guess you all know, it was already mentioned in the book that we just saw. Nuri Said, the Prime Minister of Iraq, we will smash the country with our guns and obliterate every place the Jews seek to shelter. It was the policy of that time. And he even encouraged Arabs to leave Palestine in that time. Abdul Rahman Azam, this will be, he was the General Secretary of the Arab League. This will be a war of extermination and momentous massacres and so on and so on. And it happened. So many massacres in the Arab world against Jews. We all know about Bir Yassin. Every student in Israel is studying about what happened in Bir Yassin, and I'm not proud about it. It was a massacre. Unfortunately, it happened. But many more massacres took place in the Arab world. They are never mentioned. Nobody is studying about it. Everybody knows about Bir Yassin. Nobody knows about so many massacres that took place in the Arab world. It was the background. Eventually, yes, that's what happened. So, they became refugees. Yes, it happened. But more Jews were forced out from Arab countries because of the same conflict. But they are forgotten, totally forgotten. Pictures of the Jews in what was called in Israel Barristers, which is actually transit camps, refugee camps, we can translate it. They lived in the 50s for years as refugees, totally forgotten, totally unknown. And we can see more than 42 million, and I'm speaking only about population exchange that took place. Nobody is mentioning it. It was already mentioned here that we don't see any kind of movements of right of return. How many out of the 42 million received the right of return? Does anybody know? The answer is very simple. 0. Nobody received the right of return. There is only one agreement. The Dayton Agreement, 1995, that ended the Yugoslavia war. It was decided upon that 200,000 of Serbs are entitled to go back, to return to Croatia. Very few went back because the majority did not want them. So it was agreed upon. Never happened. You are going to speak about the UNRWA, and so I will skip it. I will not speak about it. One big argument that is always mentioned about the story of refugees. People say again and again, look, it's not the same because Jews came to their own state. Germans that were expelled went to their own state, Germany, and so on and so on. Yes, it's true. Hindus went to India, Muslims went to Pakistan. But what about Arabs? They did not have state. So it's not the same. There is only one problem with this argument. Because they had their own state between 49 to 67. There was not any occupation. It was under the Arab control. They never wanted a state. They never founded a state. They had it. So this argument is again part of the industry of life. They are lying because this is the only way to demonize Israel. Let's go on. When they say right of return, we have to understand it. And they say it by themselves again and again. The meaning is the destruction of Israel. The Egyptian minister for foreign affairs said it. Refugee conference in Syria, for example. We don't have time to read all the expressions about what they mean when they say the right of return. But here is what was decided upon. Any discussion aimed at a solution of the Palestinian problem which will not based on ensuring the refugees' right to annihilate Israel will be regarded as discretion of the Arab people and an act of treason. And on and on. Dr.Cravatts, just some years ago, senior assistant of Yasser Arafat, said, the right of return is the winning card for the end of Israel. They keep on saying that, according to the international law, they have the right to return. They keep on saying it again and again. But let me tell you something. There is quite a new decision of the Human Court, of the European Court of Human Rights, just from 3 years ago, from 4 years ago, 2009. It was Greek citizens of Cyprus who asked to go back, to receive the right of return, to receive their homes back. And they, of course, appealed to the European Court, which is above all the national courts in Europe. And look what was decided upon. In the present applications, some 35 years ago, have elapsed. The local population has not remained static. They spoke about 35. We are talking about 65 years. And they go on and on. Turkish settlers from Turkey have arrived in large numbers and established their homes. Much Greece cycle property has changed hands at least once. Which means that after so many years, there is not any right, not to the property, and not, of course, to it all. And it goes on and on and on. The verdict is clear-cut. There is not right of return legally. Not according to the international law, not according to any kind of law. It's a wonderful invention, but it doesn't exist. The verdict is even dealing with the question, what is a home? And they are saying, someone who never lived in the house, it is not home anymore. Contrary to the propaganda that we hear again and again from the people who support the right of the home. Now, let me end with something very simple that we should all think about. As it was mentioned, something like 100 million people became refugees. Half of them because of population exchange that took place. Now, the story of the Nakba is defined again and again as a crime against humanity. We can do something very simple. To put some parameters. Did it happen in a time of war? Was it one-sided expulsion? Was it a population exchange? Did the side of the extremists initiate the war? Did the extremists carry out acts of deportation or other atrocities prior to their own expulsion? Let me tell you something. If we take these questions and put them all together, the Nakba that happened to the Palestinians, and yes, it happened. And yes, people were forced out of their homeland. It happened. But according to any parameter, we will find out that what happened to them is one of the lightest events in the history of population exchange. Jews were forced out from Arab countries, even if they did not declare any war, not a war of extermination against the Arab states. Arabs were expelled, yes, it happened. Not to all of them, 20%, 40%, there is a big debate. I guess Professor Morris can speak about it much better than me. Because they declared war. And not only declared war, but war of extermination against Jews. This is the real story of the right of return. Thank you very much.
I wanted to make one follow-up point. When we're discussing the cognitive war against Israel, and when I write, as I do extensively, about the campus war against Israel, if you look at the language that's used in the demonization of Israel, I think it's very telling, and it's very important for us on the other side of the argument to understand why and how words are used. So the concept of the right of return, if it's embraced without thinking about it, suggests to the listener that a person has a right to return to a place and a state that was theirs, where they lived. Well, what does this do in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian debate? It gives the Palestinians a justification for waging war against the Jewish state, and it gives credibility to the idea that is often promulgated by the enemies of Israel, that in fact, white Europeans showed up in the Holy Land after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, took a country that did not belong to them, expelled an indigenous people that had a sovereign nation, and threw those people into refugee camps, essentially. They're not. So this myth about there having been a sovereign nation called Palestine, where people called Palestinians lived and are now not allowed to return to, is very vital to the effort to destroy the credibility and, in fact, the existence of the Jewish state. So the idea of a right of return is the core silver bullet by which the enemies of Israel attempt to destroy Israel, and its moral right to even exist, because it was a nation stolen from another people. We're going to take questions at the end. I'm going to ask Professor Morris to speak to us now. And remember your questions, and you'll obviously have the ability to address them to everyone.
Okay, I was asked to comment about the speech given here last week by Joseph Massad, who teaches in Columbia. I was also asked to say a word or two about myself. I teach in Israel in Gordon University, and I'm teaching across the river this semester. In 2000, in July, the American President Bill Clinton invited Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, the head of the Palestine Authority, and Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, to Camp David, and they held talks there for 2 weeks in which they hoped, at least Clinton and Barak hoped, that a peace would be achieved between Israel and the Palestinians. And the talks, of course, as we all know, failed. One evening over dinner, and this is recorded in Dennis Ross's memoir about that peace conference. During dinner, at one point, Arafat turned to Clinton and said there was no Jewish temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. If there was a Jewish temple anywhere around, it may have been in Nablus, in Shechem, in Hebrew, but there was no temple in Jerusalem. And what Arafat was really saying there was that the Jews have no claim to Jerusalem, or to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, by extension to Jerusalem itself, and have no real claim to Palestine by extension. It's a land of the Palestinians, and therefore we cannot concede legitimacy to the Jewish claim. That's essentially what he was saying to Clinton. And Clinton, of course, was shocked. He'd grown up on the Bible and heard about some facts about Jewish history and so on, archaeology, and said to Arafat, this is not true. There was a temple there. This is legitimately called the Temple Mount. The Jews did live in Jerusalem, but Arafat would have none of it. Now, over the years, Arafat, before that, had denied the peoplehood of the Jewish people. In other words, he simply said the Jews are a religion, believers in the faith of Moses, but they are not a people, they are not a nation, therefore do not have any legitimate claim to a land of their own, say like the Arabs have claims because they are a people. What Joseph Massad did here last week, and I heard a recording, I wasn't present, but I heard a recording of the speech here. He essentially followed through with this approach. He said that Palestine is the land of the Palestinians, not the land of Israel or the land of the Jews. And he also said the Jews, this is a sort of a curious claim, it's, the Jews are descendants of Christians. In other words, the Jews are essentially, of today, are essentially converts of Christians who converted to Judaism sometime in the Middle Ages. I think he mentioned the Khazar kingdom. This is a popular story that there was a conversion of a kingdom of Christians to Judaism. So he said essentially all the Jews who took part, if you like, in the Zionist enterprise were descendants of Christians from the Middle Ages. What that means, of course, is the Jews of today cannot legitimately claim to be descendants of the Jews from 2,000 and 3,000 years ago who lived in the land of Israel, and therefore they have, the Jews of today and Zionism do not have a legitimate claim to inhabit, or certainly to have sovereignty over the land of Israel or any part of it. That was one of his claims. There is, in almost every lie, there is an element of truth, and there was a Khazar kingdom which did convert, and it's possible, nobody's sure of that, but it's possible that some of those converts eventually moved from southern Russia, where the Khazar kingdom was, to Eastern Europe, and may have been part of Eastern European Jewry, but it's certainly also true that the Jews that we saw in the movie of North Africa, the Middle East, Spain, etc., had no connection at all to the Khazars, and many of the Jews of Western Europe as well certainly cannot be said to have derived from the Khazar kingdom in southern Russia, and therefore the claim that the Jews of today are essentially Christians who have no connection to the ancient Jews is, of course, nonsensical. An alternative proposal can easily be made that the Palestinians are in some way descendants of Jews who lived in Palestine in the first millennium AD and before, and therefore they aren't in any way legitimate or have any ancient claim to the place. Certainly the beginning of Arab-Muslim claims to Palestine don't precede the 7th century, when Islam conquered Palestine and gradually converted some of its population from paganism or Christianity or Judaism to Islam. But in any case, Massad essentially was saying the Jews have no claim to Palestine because they don't have a connection to the Jews of old. And this is, of course, nonsensical. As I say, also genetically is probably largely untrue, but it's certainly untrue culturally, religiously, and historically, in the sense that Jews today speak the same language, at least the 6 million in Israel and many in America as well, do speak the same language as the Jews of 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, pray to the same God, have the same consciousness of this history, and cannot be said to be different from or not deriving from those Jews from 2,000 years ago. But that's a minor point. It's major in the sense of consciousness. And in Palestinian textbooks today in the West Bank, you will find a denial of the Jewish past and claim to Palestine and of Jewish history on which this claim is based. In that, I suppose, he's quite faithful to his mentors and political bosses. Now, a second and perhaps a more important issue which he raised and talked about, which is connected to the right of return, which was the subject of the conference, in a sense the subject of this evening's panel, deals with the subject of transfer. Transfer was a word which Zionist leaders occasionally used to describe or define a desire to move Arabs from Palestine or part of Palestine, which will become a Jewish state, to move them out of that area, which would become a Jewish state, or across the river and out of Palestine altogether. Massad said that transfer was always the policy of the Zionist movement and remains to this day the policy of the State of Israel. In other words, to expel the Arab indigenous population. And this is taken as a whole is essentially a lie. Zionism, it is true, did want to convert the land of Israel or Palestine into a Jewish state, and it did have a vast Arab majority before 1882, which was gradually whittled down by Jewish immigration. But there was a large Arab majority in the country and a very, very small number of Jews. 25,000 Jews in 1882 as against 450,000 Arabs, just to give you the numbers, before modern Zionism began. And as I said, it's true, Zionism did want to convert this country into a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, an area which would have a Jewish majority. Zionist leaders, up to 1948, except for a brief period, believed that this majority would be achieved through immigration. That is, Jews would come to the land in waves. Jews who were in distress, oppressed and so on in Europe, would come to Palestine, immigrate to Palestine, and gradually they would convert the country into a Jewish state, in the sense, a Jewish land in the state, in the sense that they would become a majority through immigration. This was essentially Jewish policy, Zionist policy. Nowhere at any point did the Zionist leadership bodies, the Zionist Congress, the Jewish Agency Executive, and the various other arms of the Zionist enterprise in terms of its governance, nobody in Zionism, and no major party in Zionism, ever advocated, and this is a point which is worth knowing and remembering, ever advocated or made it part of its platform to expel the population, the Arab population of Palestine. It was never adopted as policy by any Zionist party or governing body in the Zionist organization. What is true, and this, and of course, Massad in some way latches onto this, but it doesn't explain the circumstances and doesn't explain the briefness of this period. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, Zionist leaders, one can pinpoint Ben-Gurion, who was essentially the head of the Jewish Zionist community in Palestine, and Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the World Zionist Organization, the president. Both of them supported transfer of Arabs in the late 1930s, early 1940s. It doesn't mean that they did not continue to support immigration as the chief vehicle of achieving the Jewish majority in Palestine, but they also supported, especially in closed meetings of the Jewish Agency Executive, but in other forums as well, they did support the transfer of Arabs. They essentially wanted a voluntary transfer. In other words, the Arabs would leave of their own free will, receive compensation, and go buy tracts of land across the river in Jordan. But Ben-Gurion also said, if necessary, he also supported compulsory transfer. And this was 1938, and the date is very important. Why the Zionist leaders, or these Zionist leaders, while it never became policy of the Zionist movement, why these Zionist leaders supported the idea of transfer in the late 1930s, early 1940s. The background is crucial to understanding why they did offer this support. It was the Nazi persecution of Jews in Europe, which eventually devolved into a Holocaust during the 1940s. America had closed its gates to immigration. Britain and other Western states were not receiving Jewish immigrants. The only place where Jews fleeing Nazi persecution could actually go to was Palestine, at least potentially. This was true until 1937. Then the British began to close the doors of Palestine to Jewish immigration. But the Zionists maintained that this is the only place where they could achieve a safe haven. So there was a desperate need, especially in the 40s, but also already in the late 1930s, there was a desperate need for a safe haven. Now this Palestine wasn't a safe haven. That was one reason they, at this point, turned to this radical measure of transfer of Arabs to enable Jewish immigration. Why wasn't Palestine at the time a safe haven, and why did they therefore advocate a transfer of the Arabs? Because in 1936, the Arabs of Palestine revolted against the British government and against the Zionist enterprise, shooting on the roads, attacks on settlements, and so on. They tried to kill the Jews in Palestine and to crush the Zionist enterprise between 1936 and 1939. The British responded partly by closing down immigration, or curbing immigration to Palestine. The two things together meant that the Jews who were oppressed in Europe and facing Holocaust, as it turned out, would have nowhere to go to because the Arabs were busy killing Jews in Palestine, forcing the British who ruled Palestine to close the doors. And by killing Jews, the Arabs also basically sent a message: any Jew who comes here is going to be killed by us, don't come. In these straits, in this crisis, which, as I say, ended up with 6 million dead in Europe, Ben-Gurion and Weizmann and others turned to this desperate idea of evicting the Arabs from Palestine so as to make it a safe haven to enable Jews to find, to save themselves essentially from Europe. There's also another reason which people always forget, certainly people like Massad forget, for this brief advocacy of transfer by some of the Jewish leaders in the late 1930s, and that was Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was mentioned here a number of times, the head of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, the Mufti of Jerusalem. He advocated the expulsion, the destruction essentially of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine, and the expulsion of the majority of Jews from Palestine, all those not born before 1917. That was his formula. In other words, he was an expulsionist, and faced, if you like, or pushed by this expulsionism by the head of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, one can say the Zionist leaders like Ben-Gurion reacted by some form of expulsionism of their own. If he wanted to expel us and destroy the Jewish community here, we will have no choice but to make sure that these Arabs will not endanger our existence here by expelling them, especially given the straits, the situation of European Jewry. In any case, by the mid-1940s, the Zionist leadership abandoned the idea of expulsion, which never, as I say, turned into formal policy, official policy, and stopped advocating it. Arabs usually connect the talk of transfer, people like Massad usually connect this talk of transfer in the late 1930s, which incidentally was supported by the British Peel Commission. The British sent a commission to investigate the reasons for the Arab revolt, and it proposed a solution to the Palestine problem in 1937 of partition of the country into two states, accompanied by a transfer of the Arab population from the area which would become a Jewish state. But the British government rejected this eventually, the Arabs rejected the formula, and we reach World War II and its aftermath. In the run-up to World War, to the 1947-48 war, in effect, the Zionist leadership abandoned the idea of transfer, certainly did not advocate it or turn it into official policy, but Arab spokesmen, people like Massad, connect the talk of transfer in the late 1930s, early 1940s to what happened to the Palestinians during the 1948 war, which was in effect a displacement of 700,000 of them. There were about 1.3 million Arabs in Palestine at the beginning of the 1948 war. Some 700,000 were displaced from their homes. Incidentally, the majority being displaced from their homes from one part of Palestine into another part of Palestine, not out of Palestine, which is important incidentally because the definition of a refugee, if you look in a dictionary like the Oxford Dictionary, you'll find that it's somebody who's being displaced from his country as a result of persecution, war, etc. Most Palestinian refugees from 1948 were not displaced out of Palestine and therefore not actually refugees. This may be quibbling, it may not be, but it's worth knowing that there's a definition for refugee. In any case, in 1948 what happened wasn't the result of Zionist pre-planning or policy or systematic implementation, as Massad and most Arab spokesmen usually say. It's actually a subject which I looked at very closely through documentation from various countries, Israeli, American, English, and so on. The refugee problem, that is, the 700,000 who were displaced as a result during the 48 war, the main reason for the displacement from their homes was the war itself. Fear of being caught up in the war, being hurt in the war, and the vast majority, according to the documentation, fled their homes as a result of the acts of war. Zionist troops going over to the offensive, attacking a village or a town, or threatening to attack it, or fear of such attack. This was the reason for most people fleeing, not expulsion orders. A small number of those displaced, of the 700,000, were displaced as a result of direct Israeli expulsions. There's no avoiding the subject. This did happen. There were places where there were expulsions, and they accounted for a small number of this 700,000. Places like Lida and Ramle in July 1948, there were expulsions there. A small number also fled their homes, as for example from Haifa in April 1948, as a result of orders or advice from their own leaders. Arab leaders advising their people to move out of their homes perhaps an expectation that they would be coming back eventually on the wings of victorious invading Arab armies. But in any case, they left their homes as a result of advice or orders from their leaders. But the vast bulk of the 700,000 who were displaced from their homes and were later called refugees did leave their homes as a result of the war itself, the fear of war, and not as a result of a policy of expulsion by the Israeli government or soldiers. There's a one-to-one correspondence, if you like, between the departure of Arabs from specific villages and towns and Jewish Haganah, IZL, and so on attacks. And there's a certain number of the Palestinians overrun by Israeli troops, 150 or 160,000. There were 700,000 displaced from the area which became the Jewish state. 160,000 remained in their homes and became Israeli citizens in the wake of the 48 war, which in my view is proof that there was no systematic policy of expulsion. Had there been such a policy, these Arabs would not have been allowed to remain in their places, and they constituted at the time 20% of Israel's population at the end of the 1948 war. 80% Jews, 20% Arabs. These 20% wouldn't have remained in place had there been such a policy. I'll add one other thing in this connection. No Israeli soldier during the war or after the war was ever tried by Israeli courts for expelling Arabs, and no Israeli soldier was ever tried by Israeli courts for not expelling Arabs. In other words, had there been a policy of expulsion, there would have been people facing court-martial for not expelling communities. This didn't happen. In other words, there wasn't any policy. There was an atmosphere of transfer in the country. The Arabs had begun a war, attacked the Jewish community. I'll get to this in a second. And this is what precipitated the war, which precipitated the departure of these 700,000 Arabs. But there wasn't any such policy. It was never enunciated, never discussed in decision-making forums. There was no trace of any decision from any decision-making forum that there was a decision to expel the Arabs. It just didn't happen. And had there been, and there's enormous amounts of documentation from the 48 war, up and down all the different chains of command, you would have found traces of such expulsion orders had there been some. There weren't any. It's as simple as that. Now, the creation of the refugee problem should be seen, in my view, within the context, and Ben said it, should be seen within the context of war. Massad, in his talk here, spoke about the war, and he talked continuously, repeatedly. I listened to the tape. The word appears repeatedly, of Israeli aggression in the war. And I think this is the biggest lie in his talk here last week. The United Nations, expressing the will of the international community on the 29th of November 1947, passed a resolution supporting the partition of Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jewish agency, Ben Gurion, accepted the UN resolution, and the Arab states and the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected it. And not only did the Palestinian Arab leadership reject the resolution and the compromise proposed by the international community, but the day after the resolution was passed, on the 30th of November 1947, began shooting at the Jews. The Palestinian Arab militias initiated a civil war between the two communities in Palestine, and this was the start of the 1948 war. The Palestinian Arab militias attacking Jewish settlements, traffic, and so on, and from that gradually evolved a full-scale civil war between the two communities. And the creation of the refugee problem has to be seen as a product or a byproduct of this aggression by the Arabs of Palestine against the Jews of Palestine. In the course of the fighting, the Arabs were on the offensive, were the aggressors, if you like, from the end of November 47 until the end of March 1948. For 4 months, they were the ones who were busy attacking, and the Jews were the ones who were busy defending themselves. During those months, about 1,000 Israelis were killed by Arab attack. In the beginning of April 1948, the Jews decided to go over to the offensive and began to conquer Arab neighborhoods and villages and rural swaths of territory. In those conquests, once they went over to the offensive and began conquering these neighborhoods, before that, there were no expulsions in Palestine. No Arab village was expelled by Israeli troops during the first 4 months of that civil war. The expulsions where they did occur, or the flight of Arabs, which was the majority phenomenon, it did occur from the beginning of April when the Jews went over to the offensive. And it happened because the villages which the Jews attacked and conquered, and the neighborhoods which they attacked and conquered, were the bases of the Arab militias which were busy attacking the Jews, had been attacking them for the previous 4 months. Much as the Jewish settlements, the kibbutzim, there were 200 or 300 kibbutzim at the time, were the bases of the Jewish militias who were attacking the Arabs or counter-attacking against the Arabs. Both sides, it was a civil war, it wasn't a normal war. The bases of the militias were the villages and the urban neighborhoods, and they were legitimate targets for attack. And when the Jews attacked, the Arabs fled, or before the Jews attacked, the Arabs fled from these areas. And this was the main phase of the creation of the refugee problem. About 300,000 Arabs fled their homes during the months April, May, and June 1948. But to say that the Jews were the aggressors in this war is absurd, and it's a blanket lie. He did bring a quote. I heard the quote on the tape, Mossad, in which he quotes inaccurately Ben Gurion saying we are in some way the aggressors. It wasn't exactly clear the way Mossad translated it, but in the 1930s, Ben Gurion did actually say in one of the closed speeches in a closed forum that from the Arab perspective, this was the way he phrased it, Ben Gurion, and he was a clear-headed man. From the Arab perspective, we the Jews are the political aggressors in this conflict. He wasn't talking about specific acts of aggression in the 30s. He said that militarily the Arabs are the aggressors. They're constantly attacking us and killing us. But politically, we are the aggressors. What he meant from the Arab perspective, and what he meant is very clear. The Jews weren't here before 1882. They began to arrive and want to convert the country into a Jewish state. In that sense, from the Arab perspective, they are invaders who have no connection to the place and are out to take over the place. Of course, he didn't accept that. He said, like any Zionist, the place is ours. The Arabs are the usurpers here. They weren't here before the 7th century. They conquered the country, took it over, Arabized it, Islamized it, etc. But this is really our country from ancient times. But from their perspective, they don't care about ancient Jewish history. They know nothing about Jewish history. They care about the here and now. And here and now, in a political sense, we are the aggressors. He was talking about the 1930s. Mossad used the quote and pushed it on into the 1940s. He didn't tell you when the speech was made, and therefore attributed it essentially to 1948. But this isn't what Ben Gurion said. He was talking about the whole conflict. Militarily, it's clear that the Arabs of Palestine were the initiators of the war and the aggressors. This was the war, or the civil war part of the 48 war, which began at the end of November 47 and ended on the 15th of May, or the 14th of May, 1948, by which time the Jews had essentially crushed the Palestinian Arab militias and declared their state on the 14th of May. On the 15th of May, 4 Arab armies crossed the border, the international border, and entered Palestine, and several of them attacked the Jewish state. The Egyptian, the Syrian, and the Iraqi armies crossed into Jewish territory assigned by the United Nations for the Jewish state, and attacked Jewish settlements and civilians and troops in that territory. They were the aggressors, the Arab armies, on the 15th of May. They invaded a country which wasn't theirs in violation of, in defiance of the United Nations resolutions. Say that the Jews were the aggressors, the Jews attacked the Arab states is an absurdity. Their armies are the ones which crossed the river. something which the Israelis were very far from wanting, a war with the Arab states, which they weren't sure they were going to win, but the Arabs initiated. Another point he made eventually the Israelis beat off the Arab armies, and the country was in a sense partitioned, in line more or less with the UN resolution. The Arabs, the Jordanians getting the West Bank, the Egyptians getting the Gaza Strip, and Israel getting pre-1949 Israel. Of Israeli propaganda and policy during the 1950s, 1960s was that Israel was a small, beleaguered country surrounded by large Arabs and stronger Arab enemies. What Mossad said in his speech was that Israel was essentially the Goliath in 1948, and the Arab states were the David. In other words, the Israelis, even though there were only 650,000 Jews in Palestine in the end of 1947, they were the stronger party, and the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs and the Arab states around, were the weaker party. This was one of his themes. And he actually brought a couple of quotes. He quoted a number of American officials who said that something more or less in line with that the Jews are stronger than the Arabs. Well, Mossad hasn't actually read the documentation. This isn't his field, but I have. And the American intelligence agencies got together at the beginning of May as Israel was about to proclaim statehood. And as the Arabs were threatening to invade, the Arab states said they would invade as soon as the Israelis proclaimed statehood. The American intelligence organizations, the CIA, and there were a couple of others, the State Department intelligence, Army, Navy, Air Force intelligence, they got together and they hammered out a memorandum which they sent up the chain of command, describing what they saw would happen, what they foresaw would happen if the Arab states went to war against Israel on the 15th of May. And the consensus there in that memorandum was that the Arab states would win the war, not initially, but within 2 years, because numbers would tell. There were 650,000 Jews in Palestine, there were 1.3 million Palestinian Arabs, and there were about 20 to 30 million Arabs in the Arab states. Today there are many more, but the numbers were smaller then. Of the Arab states involved in the conflict, there were about 30 million potentially who would be involved, and they of course had vast resources economically, in terms of manpower, etc., and the CIA, etc., believed the Arabs would win the war. This was their prediction, which they sent up the chain of command. The British, incidentally, reached exactly the same conclusion, that the Arabs might not win initially, but within a year or two, numbers and would eventually tell. We know, of course, that the Arabs didn't win. One further thing stems from this assessment, this intelligence assessment. Just before the 14th of May, before Israel declared statehood, the American Secretary of State, George Marshall, met with the number 2 man in the Israeli hierarchy, Moshe Shertok, the foreign minister-to-be, Moshe Sharet later he was called, and tried to dissuade him and Israel from proclaiming statehood. Marshall meets him in the State Department and says to Shertok, don't declare statehood, terrible things are going to happen. And Shertok asks him what's going to happen, and he says, you won't win this war. What troubled Marshall wasn't the declaration of statehood by Israel so much as the fear that the declaration would trigger a pan-Arab invasion, which is exactly what happened, and that the Americans would be called upon to save Israel, and would have to send tens of thousands of Marines to Palestine to save the Jews from a massacre by the Arabs. This was the American view and fear, which is why they tried to dissuade, one of the reasons, they tried to dissuade the Israelis from declaring statehood. As we know, the Israelis ignored this advice, declared statehood, and eventually went on to beat the Arab states in the war itself. Let me add one last thing, which connects directly to the subject of the session. In June 1948, a few weeks after, about 4 weeks after, it was on the 16th of June 1948, 4 weeks after the Arab states began the invasion of Palestine and the pan-Arab attack on Israel, the Israeli cabinet met, 16th June 1948, and essentially decided without a vote, but it was like consensual among the ministers. Each of them spoke in turn, Ben-Gurion, Sharet, Chertok, and so on. They decided not to allow a refugee return. That is, they decided those, and by then about 400,000 Palestinians had been displaced from their homes. But the cabinet decides on the 16th of June, and then it reiterated this decision formally in August and again in September. It decides not to allow the Palestinians to return to their homes. Now, the reason they decided this, and this incidentally remains the reason Israel to this day, and this has been the consistent policy of all Israeli governments since 48, the reason they decided in June 1948 not to allow the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes was very simple. It was a military strategic reason. These Palestinians had attempted to attack Israel, had attacked Israel, had attempted to destroy the Zionist enterprise, to destroy Israel at birth, essentially. Were they to come back, to be allowed to come back, they would represent necessarily a fifth column. They would come back to their villages and towns behind the front lines. Meanwhile, the Arab states are attacking from the various borders, from the various directions. You allow these refugees back behind your lines, along your main roads and so on. You will have chaos in the back, behind. They will rebel against you. They will attack you. It would be unsustainable militarily. It would also, incidentally, and this probably occurred to the leaders as well, be unsustainable politically. You allow a vast number of Arabs to return to the country, and you've got 650,000 Jews. You allow, say, 400,000 in June. It would be 700,000 by the end of the war. You end up with having almost equilibrium in terms of demography by people who want to destroy you, who don't want you to exist as a Jewish state. So they decided not to allow the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. The same applies to the Israeli government today. Now, there's something, of course, that sounds like a harsh decision. Sometimes in wars, countries attack each other, conquer each other, conquer capitals. The Germans conquered Paris in 1940. 5 million Parisians fled Paris in 1940 southwards, but within weeks they returned to Paris and were allowed to return. The problem in this case is an existential one. The problem isn't one of individual rights and suffering. And there is suffering, and 700,000 people are displaced, are not allowed to come back to their homes. There's a vast amount of suffering. But you can't look at it in terms of individual rights of people being allowed individually to return to their homes. It's a collective problem and a problem of strategy and security. And allowing, at the time, 700,000 Palestinians to return to their homes would have destroyed the state of Israel, as simple as that. You want to give up a Jewish state, even though you've just won a military victory, this is the way to bring about its dissolution. And the same applies today. Today there are 1.4 million Arabs in Israel, Israeli Arab citizens, 1.4 million. There are between 5 and 6 million Arabs registered with the United Nations as refugees. It's those still remaining from 1948, but essentially they're children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. 5 to 6 million. You add 5 to 6 million to the 1.3 million Arabs who live in Israel, and you end up with more Arabs in the Jewish state, if they are allowed to return, than Jews, because there are less than 6 million Jews in Israel. That's the demography. So Israel, if it wants to dissolve itself, commit suicide, if you like, should allow back all these Palestinian refugees. If it doesn't want to commit suicide, it can't. And this is the real reason why Israel is opposed to what the Palestinians demand as a right of return.
Two points that you made there. One is that Ephraim Karsh noted that in some towns during the war, as much as 60% of the Palestinians had already fled. Some of them were the Arab leaders and the wealthier Arabs who had abandoned, or out of fear of their own personal safety and to protect their assets, had fled in advance. And as Benny mentioned, many Arabs had left the towns because they were told by the Arab leadership that there was going to be a momentous slaughtering of the Jews, and then they could come back to their homes once all the Jews were dead. The other interesting point that you touched on, which I think is sort of crucial to this argument where Israel has been accused of being an ethnic cleanser of the poor, oppressed Palestinians, that during the partition planning, the crafters of the partition plan had anticipated, just as was done in other partitions, that there would be a transfer of populations, that Jews from Arab lands would come to Israel, to the new Jewish state, and that Arabs who had lived in what was becoming the Jewish state would go to the new Arab state, the new Palestinian state. We forget, of course, or many of us don't forget, that the Arabs specifically rejected the idea of partition. They didn't want a new Arab state, not because they didn't want an Arab state, but because they didn't want a Jewish state to be created. So the idea of transfer is something that has been done throughout history and was part of the plan in the creation of an Arab and a Jewish state. And it was not to be perceived as ethnic cleansing, but a voluntary migration of populations to their new respective states.
I have to comment on that. So, in the Peel Commission proposals of 1937, there was an element of a clause relating to transfer, that there would be a mutual exchange of population, as they called it, essentially a transfer of Arabs out of the Jewish state area to be. But in the United Nations Partition Resolution of 1947, there was no transfer clause, there was no exchange of population envisioned. It wasn't there, it wasn't in the partition plan of the United Nations. And it was in the earlier partition plan.
So, Asaf Romarowski is now going to talk about the United Nations Workers' Relief Agency, which is crucial and central to the idea of the right of return. Why? Because without a people to return, there can be no right exercised and no damage done to the Jewish state through this demographic subversion, as I mentioned, that Professor Karsh calls it. I heard it at the APEC conference where Asaf spoke with another expert on that experts are now suggesting that of the original Palestinian refugees, the actual refugees, not their descendants, which of course refugee status has never been given to, except in this case of the Palestinians, there's only about 40,000 remaining alive. Now, if that's true, Israel could embrace and incorporate 40,000 actual Palestinian refugees without damage to the Jewish character of Israel. But the idea that all Palestinian refugees and all of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren have Palestinian refugee status makes that equation for Israel existentially impossible and dangerous. So Asaf, who is an expert on UNRWA, wants to explain to us how this is used as a tool and has been used as a tool effectively in the cognitive war against Israel.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I apologize for being late. It's hard to get out of Philadelphia, and I thought to get here tonight. A good segue to follow through on what my co-panelists have said tonight gives really the historical and sociological understanding of how this has all been codified. The UN entity that basically embodies the historical and the demographic context is UNRWA, which is the UN Workers' Relief Agency that was established in 1949, solely devoted to the Arabs of Palestine. The whole configuration of this UN agency is an anomaly at large within the General Assembly and how it is configured. Its sister organization, the UNHCR, is quite different. But I'll talk about tonight about how UNRWA came to fruition and really what was so unique about UNRWA. Going into what Professor Morris was talking about as far as he started talking about the comment of what defines a refugee is really at the core of this larger debate. Really, anybody who is fleeing for one's life or feels a need that he or she is threatened, the land no longer exists, that defines as part of the definition of what UNHCR, the United Commission of Refugees, defines a refugee. When UNRWA was created in 1949, and it's important to note it was created a little bit before the UNHCR was created, they saw it not to be the case. And what Benny was referring to about before, that they saw the transfer of population, the land is still there, made the General Assembly believe that UNRWA, that the Palestinians and the Arabs of Palestine were a unique entity, a unique set of people, and that's why UNRWA was created as a temporary organization that in essence has no end. The entire raison d'etre of UNRWA is based on a Palestinian right of return. Also worth noting that UNRWA was created as an Article 22, that is to say that it was based on voluntary contributions. To say that, so really, when you try to understand the amount or the so-called oversight that the General Assembly had and still has on UNRWA, is really non-existent because it's based on voluntary contributions. It's important to note that because much of UNRWA's history, financially speaking, was based on ongoing asking for money because the growing need of the refugees is expanding and inflating. And the reason for that has to do, of course, with the number of who is a refugee. And according to UNRWA's definition, really it has the most expansive definition of refugee we've ever seen. UNRWA defines a refugee anybody who was in Palestine between 1946 and 1948 and their descendants. And really, there has been an ongoing, since the article on the UN's article about the Refugee Convention of 1951, there has been a significant expansion of refuginess as it relates to the Arabs of Palestine between 1951 all the way until the mid-60s, where we come to this most expansive definition that includes the descendantry of Palestinian refugees, which explains how UNRWA comes up with the number of 5.6 million refugees worldwide, though I have come across more liberal accounts that talk about 11 million. But if we're talking about the original, if we're talking about the 5 to 6 million and where they come up with that number, it's based on the descendants. If you look at Islamic theology, you're talking about the fact that usually lineage is based on the father. There's been a latest attempt by UNRWA to include the mother. So if you talk about the amount of refugees, basically if you try to count 20 years down the road, everybody's a Palestinian refugee, and everybody's entitled to have a right of return. That, in essence, is really the core of the problem and how this plays out. The temporary sense of UNRWA is also critical. UNRWA was, and UNRWA's mandate was to what the State Department calls, if you look at State Department documentation, I would argue, in my research that I've come across, actually, the State Department actually went against its own policy when it comes to the issue of Palestine, was the question of reintegration, reassimilation, and resettlement. Which was the policy that we started here in the United States as it came to the Tennessee Valley as far as irrigation and trying to resettle refugees. And there was an attempt early on in the 50s to try to implement that in Palestine. It never came to fruition. And all along, because of the push and pull that existed between the local population and its other countries, the other Arab countries, who basically were very happy that the Arabs of Palestine remained refugees. Ben-Dror referred to here as a quote by one of the former heads of the Amman office of UNRWA, Sir Alexander Galloway, basically saying that they never want to solve the problem, they want to keep it as open wound, they don't really give a damn about the Arabs of Palestine. And really, that in essence goes to the heart of the core of the Nakba, who is to blame for the war of 1948 and why they have remained in this situation. Interestingly enough, in some meetings that were taking place in the 1950s, between the preamble to UNRWA were actually many missionaries, and the main deliverer of goods for the Arabs of Palestine were actually the Quakers. The American Friends Service Committee, who had operations in Akko and operations in Gaza, and they had many meetings which I'll read later on, to talk about the environment And some of these negotiations, very interesting enough to find out, there was an accusation against Israel where they, interested in not the Quakers but the Arabs who were representing the refugees, who were accusing Israel of saying, well, how can you as a democracy, and at the time they quoted Russia and the US, and say, not be responsible for the Arabs of Palestine. Basically, they wanted to wipe their hands off the refugee problem and say, it's your responsibility, you created the problem, you're responsible for the creation of a Nakba at large, that is to say, it's your responsibility to solve the problem. And that has been the push and pull all along by who is to resolve the refugee problem. That is also the same reason why, with the exception of Jordan, no Arab country, Lebanon has elevated their status, has ever granted the Palestinian citizenship. That is to say that as long as they are as long as they are refugees, we should continue on the acrimonious feelings of war, the Nakba mentality against Israel, because it's their responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem, and it's their responsibility to solve it. And that was the push and pull that has gone on for years, 65 years later, a temporary organization that we still have UNRWA to look at. There was one point that Benny made that I wanted to touch on, which is also very important, as far as, of course, I completely agree that, of course, no Israeli government would ever accept the full right of return because of what that would do, alter the Jewish character of the Jewish nation and the demographic integrity of the Jewish state. But there were proposals along the way. And to Richard's point, that if you look at the original refugees of 1948-49, which is based on UNHCR, that says basically you can only be a refugee for one generation, unlike UNRWA, then today, based on the ages of those original 48-49, you would come to about between 35 and 40,000 individuals. They can have a right of return. That would not alter the Jewish demographic majority of the state of Israel. Even early on, again, brokered by the Quakers, there were already attempts to say, will you take in 200,000, 300,000 of the original refugees, and proposals that were made to Shurtai. And some of these proposals were actually seriously entertained. The only caveat was, would you accept Israel's right to live in peace? And they always said, no, we're not going to accept it, because again, the idea was that Nakba mentality is much more stronger, and that we can continue on the fight while this becomes the symbol of the Palestinian cause. I would also go further to say, if you fast forward to the environment today, you fast forward, if you look at the sense of Palestinian identity, and I think it was mentioned here when there was discussion about Haj Amin al-Husseini, when there was discussion about how he viewed, I guess if you look at the history of Palestinian identity, part of that has become rooted in the symbolism and the idea of being a refugee. So when Mahmoud Abbas goes to the United Nations and asks for a Palestinian state tomorrow, but I'm not willing to give up the right of return, part of it has to do with the fact that if you give up the right of return, are you really giving up your identity? Your refugeness becomes that symbol of Palestinian identity. So if you look at modern day leaders, from Nasser all the way up to Bin Laden in his day, Yasser Arafat, they said, we're never going to give up the right of return, we're never going to give up our refugeness, and that's really, unfortunately, how they have been tragically used and abused by their own people. To say that the refugees are the greatest atrocity the world has ever seen, and it is the responsibility of the world to solve it. To that end, what has happened since the 1950s, since really 1949 all the way today, we have poured, and when I talk about we, I'm talking about the West, millions of dollars, billions of dollars into the UNRWA pot. You talk about the environment today. The U.S. is the third largest contributor to UNRWA today. We're talking in the tone of about $240 million a year annually to go to UNRWA. And when UNRWA goes to Congress and asks for money, all UNRWA has to basically say is we take care of the betterment of Palestinian refugees and write us a large check, which we do. There has not been an end to that problem. And part of the reason we give that money is because there is this cognitive dissonance that exists when we talk about UNRWA and refugees, that there are people starving. And the fact that they're living in tents and they're fleeing for their lives. And the perception is that how can we as the U.S. be responsible for this ongoing starvation? without really looking into what is happening in the refugee camps. Are these really camps? Are these really refugees by anybody's definition? I'm sure Ben-Hur touched on this issue, but if you look approximately, there have been, since World War II, about 165 million refugees worldwide. All have been assimilated with the exception of one nationality, that is the Palestinians. And there's a reason why they continue to exist and why they fester with this internal idea of becoming, this is a symbol of Palestinian identity. On that note, I would argue really that until the Palestinians evolve and really create their own identity that is independent of anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism, you're not going to see a full-fledged Palestinian state because it's based on this hatred and it's based also on the symbolism of refuginess, statelessness. That's all part of what was created. There have been many attempts, even by the State of Israel. 2 years after the Six-Day War in 1969, under Levi Eshkol, who actually proposed to the Palestinians to say, you should leave the refugee camps. If you don't want us to build the homes for you, we will allocate the land and go build them yourselves. And the refusal was, of course, a flat no. And the reason for that was Arafat brings Fatah and PLO together in 1968 as recruiting for the revolution. If the Palestinians had a better lifestyle, if they had a better socioeconomic condition moving out of refugee camps, why would they support the revolution? And so, again, there was a need to understand how UNRWA has played into this larger issue. It's important to note that really, if you look at UNRWA at its core, and really the mandate of UNRWA, UNRWA was forbidden, and really this goes into other UN agencies, to get involved in politics. And really what is the anomaly about UNRWA is that UNRWA has become essentially an advocate for the Palestinian cause. What UNRWA discovered, and I would give UNRWA a little bit of credit, between the first Secretary General of UNRWA was a Canadian by the name of Kennedy, and they really tried up until the 60s to stay kind of true to their humanitarian mandate as far as being a neutral organization, but they discovered that they're not raising much money. What they did find out, and they were told very clearly by the Arab world, that we will continue to support you and write large checks as long as you become the full-fledged advocate for the Palestinian cause. And that's really how the Arab world, to some extent, feels better about what it does by giving contributions to UNRWA without taking in the Palestinians and giving them citizenship. So really, by the time you get to the 1960s, UNRWA becomes a full-fledged advocate of the Palestinian cause, and this is how the money has continued to flow in by giving UNRWA, by giving these sums of money. But interestingly enough, the larger sums of money are not coming from the Arab world. The majority of the monies are actually coming in from the West. When you look at today, what's happening, you're talking about the EU, the US, the first Western country to that end that decided to defund from UNRWA is Canada, our friends to the north, who decided that because UNRWA has no accountability, it's very hard to figure out where the money is going, that they are deciding to defund from UNRWA, from their contribution to UNRWA, and they're only giving money today to Palestinian Authority projects where they can see some kind of accountability and some kind of transparency. That should give you an indication about even how much the Arab world feels sympathetic towards the Palestinians when the majority of the money is not coming from them, but it's coming from the West. And that is to say, again, ties into the actual narrative that it is a responsibility of the West to solve the problem because they created the problem to begin with. You talked about the Palestinian diaspora. It's interesting to look and see the kind of views towards the Arab world. The two largest Palestinian populations in the United States of 1948, 1949 are Dearborn, Michigan, and Jacksonville, Florida. I was able to unearth an op-ed in 1949 that was written in Dearborn, Michigan by the original refugees, and they actually, interestingly enough, criticized the Arab world, asking, where are the princes? Where are the sultans? Where are the individuals who are our brethren? Why are they not taking care of us? Why are we putting all of the onus on the West and Israel? Which is a very telling statement when they left and the way they got here and whatnot. But those are things that are not usually voiced or heard because, again, the perception is, and really it is, that UNRWA is the gatekeeper of
the right of return. It is synonymous to Palestinian identity, and there is no incentive to defund UNRWA at large. UNRWA's official mandate is that UNRWA will continue to cease to exist when there is resolution for the right of return. Until the parties don't come together, then we are not going, our services are still needed. The modern part, which is again, aspects that are tied to the historical element that need to be understood, is of course how UNRWA operates within the refugee camps because it's not neutral. What UNRWA has done, unfortunately, over the years is also become a conduit to terrorist activity, the incitement that we talk about education in UNRWA schools, and really the main byproduct and the main kind of goods that UNRWA provides are education. UNRWA's mandate is to teach based on what is defined as the host country. If the host country is given this kind of, is Hamas, for example, or is working in, Nahar al-Bared, which is one of the largest refugee camps in Lebanon, because Hezbollah is impacting what's happening there, the environment. These are things that are impacting the ideology and the incitement that are coming out of UNRWA camps. In 2004, Secretary General of UNRWA at the time, Peter Hansen, openly admitted on a Canadian publication that, of course, there are members of Hamas part of UNRWA. They are part of the process. We don't distinguish. When somebody applies for a job with UNRWA, one is not asked, were you ever a member of a terrorist organization? That's not part of the, you can be whatever you want to help the cause. That's legitimately part of the Palestinian people. So again, if you look about funding, and you look at the issue of how this plays out, there's actually an article within USAID. It talks about, Section 301 talks about funding of terrorist organizations. And so part of what we've been trying to do here in the United States is look for some kind of accountability and transparency when it comes to UNRWA, looking to see how are we going to see where our money is going and what it's actually funding. On a public policy note, this is interesting, to look at as well. For the first time, Richard mentioned my latest panel with Einat Vilf, who was a former MK in the State of Israel, also who adopted a similar bill that has been proposed by Senator Mark Kirk about ending the right of return. Ending the right of return, again, talking about the fact that the right of return is based only on the refugees that deserve to get those services, that is to say, the original refugees of 1948-49. So now, for the first time, there has been a parallel track between Israel and the United States. And I mention that because when you ask the Department of Defense in Israel, when you ask the MFA in Israel, their policy of those agencies within the State of Israel, that as bad as UNRWA is, we do not want to disrupt their services. Because the perception in the State of Israel is that if UNRWA, as bad as UNRWA is, if they don't provide these services, it's going to be Israel's responsibility. So though Israel does not contribute monetarily to UNRWA, whenever there is a vote, they vote in favor of that. So this is part of the back and forth between the West and Israel about the funding of UNRWA, and should UNRWA be defunded and whatnot. But I think that if we're looking to go forward, an adaptation of who are the refugees and where are they going, we have to have an end date. Otherwise, this will continue to fester as we move along. UNRWA itself has no incentive to defund itself. If you look at UNRWA's employees, we're talking about billions of dollars in pension funds. They have a really self-perpetuating interest in staying in business. The other point that I would note, which I think is also quite telling as you look at the historical context of UNRWA all the way to today, is that basically UNRWA has also become the largest employer of Palestinians. If you look and compare between UNHCR and UNRWA, UNHCR has for worldwide refugees 5,000 to 6,000 employees. That's it. UNRWA employs in the tone of close to 30,000 individuals, the majority who are Palestinian. And so there is no incentive to find somebody who is going to say, within Palestinian society, that UNRWA has no right to exist. The majority of Palestinians are alums of the UNRWA schools. One of the ministers of education within the Palestinian Authority a few years ago was a superintendent in the UNRWA school. So it's very hard to even find a Palestinian who would argue that UNRWA services are not needed because they are they serve them and they have this ongoing need. I would even go further today, if you look at the current modern day environment, that UNRWA has basically become a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. All these services that, if there is going to be a Palestinian state to be, should be provided by the Palestinian Authority, not UNRWA. What UNRWA is, what the Palestinian Authority today is doing is basically double dipping. They're getting monies from UNRWA, they're getting money from USAID, and there's a lot of dubious monies going around, to say the least, about where the money is going. And obviously now with the recent events that Salam Fayyad has resigned, even more so about the question about is that money going to other terrorist organizations. Those should all be of concern to us as we try to understand the anomaly within UNRWA. I'll end on one more point and then to finish up my remarks. I think that it is critical to understand that, again, we know about the historical narrative of what it means to be a Palestinian. We know what it means at large by this larger issue of identity. But UNRWA has basically hijacked the Palestinians. And when you talk about UNRWA's taking care of the betterment of Palestinians, I would argue that has not been the case, because UNRWA has basically fed off their current situation to make the case for their existence. I mean, it's interesting to look at what's currently happening today to give you a better illustration, but UNRWA has been more concerned about those who are living within Israel, those Palestinians within the Palestinian areas, than they have been concerned about refugees, for example, living in Syria. If they're concerned about refugees worldwide, where there's a lot of again, human rights violations, why aren't they concerned about more of the real human rights violations? And those are starting, and again, UNRWA has taken a lot of flack for this, and now starting to speak out about that we are taking care of other refugees, specifically those of Palestinian descent in Syria, but their focus has been really on this issue. And if it's not been about Palestinian refugees, then they don't get involved. Again, this is part of why they've become the gatekeeper of Palestinian identity, why they become the gatekeeper of the right of return. And to sum it up, if we are concerned about the betterment of Palestinians, to kind of look forward to where the environment would actually change, I would say that weaning off, to begin with it, to start with at least, UNRWA for Palestinian Authority is a first good step, but I would also go further to say that UNRWA needs to be defunded. Otherwise, you're going to see a continuation of this, of the historical and political context that was described here earlier, embodied within a UN agency that really has no end. Thank you very much.
As it is for academics to take questions and not speak themselves, I think we'd like to give you the opportunity to ask anybody on the panel anything that came to mind while they were speaking. There's microphones at the front of both sides of the room. Feel free to grab some snacks and a drink to refresh yourself in the meantime, too.
Hello, Sticks. I'd like to ask the members of the panel. I once asked Ali Abu Nima, who was one of the motivating forces behind both the one-state conference at Harvard and also the right of return conference here at you. If Palestinian nationalism bridled so much at occupation, then why in the 19 years from 1949 to 1967, when their territory was not only occupied, but it was annexed by a foreign power, namely a Hashemite clan from the Hijaz, where were the expressions of Palestinian nationalism for 19 years? And he had no answer. I think this is a powerful argument to use. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there were expressions of Palestinian nationalism. I'm not aware of any. From Tawfiq Canaan or from Mahmoud Darwish. It was non-existent, but perhaps you can address this.
Well, a simple answer, two answers. One is that they have been incorporated in the West Bank by an Arab state which ruled them from 449 until 67. And being ruled by an Arab is not exactly comparable for them to be ruled by a Jew, which is what happened to them after 67. That's one thing. The second thing is you have to remember the Palestinian society in 1948 was crushed. Their leadership was or destroyed or dispersed around the world. They weren't in a fighting mood, and they certainly weren't allowed to organize in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip by the Egyptians by the local secret police, that is, by the Jordanian and Egyptian authorities. So they weren't able to, and as I say, they'd been crushed. They weren't politically ready to surge. This happened only about 10, 15 years after 67, after Israel took over the territories.
I think we should hear the audience.
I wanted to add one point. I had heard another theory of this, that initially the Arab states were fighting against Zionism and the presence of Israel by promising extermination and military conquest. And this began not to be an effective tool in the West, where there was sympathy for the Jewish state and so forth. So with Russian suggestion, the Arab world and the Palestinian cause made a cognitive shift where they started not talking about conquest by military means, but the self-affirmation of the Palestinian cause, the seeking of statehood, which was something that could resonate within the West and sounded more palatable than wiping out Jews that had just come out of the Holocaust. Charles.
Charles James. This was a wonderful panel. I wish we should curricularize each one of these talks and teach all the Jews in all the schools that we know to think this way, have this as an armament in what you say is a cognitive war. I want to take one step backwards and have us think about what happened at BU, because it's what's happening to us for the last 25 years. And it's a pattern, and the pattern is they tell lies about Jews, and then we respond. And I think we were all taught that this is a good method by Myths and Facts, which was the basic Hasbara doctrine since I went to college almost. They lie, and then we kind of correct it. And I want to suggest that we flip this, because it's not working. We're not winning by this. No matter how brilliant all these things are, they're lying and we're responding. So we get, I know everybody in the room, just about. We get our people here, and we sit here and say, yeah, it's the truth, and they're brilliant truths, and I'm going to use it in my next argument, and this is great. But why don't we take hold of the agenda? And the agenda is that lies about Jews are lethal, and that they're lying about Jews. So why don't we have conferences that start out before they get here and say, we're going to talk about the lies about Israel. And, we're going to have a conference about this guy who lied, and a conference about that guy who lied, and a conference about all these lies. And then let them respond.
Actually, as you know, our colleague Richard Landis, who was with us tonight, calls this lethal narratives. And the title of my book is Genocidal Liberalism. And it was coined by David Frum, who was George Bush's, the younger speechwriter. And what he meant by that is that people that mean to do good and are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause don't understand that they are co-enabling people that actually want to exterminate and murder Jews by sympathizing with the cause. And these lethal narratives are popular. I don't think you're suggesting that we should lie first and let them tell the truth. But students ask me, I go around the country giving speeches on Campus Anti-Semitism and Campus Anti-Israelism, which is my core focus. And students sometimes stand up and say, well, what can we do? And it's a difficult challenge, because I don't think we want to use the tactics of the opposition, which not only include lies, but week-long anti-Israel, anti-Semitic Israel apartheid week that happened about 240 campuses and so forth. It's a difficult question, but continue your thought.
Obviously I don't want us to lie, but Why don't, they're going to come and say that Israel's apartheid? Well, that's not, every lie that they say, it's the opposite of what actually happened. They actually do it, right? So land theft, who's the biggest land thieves in the Middle East, right? Cruelty, you can't be any crueler than them. Apartheid, Arab apartheid. So let's have conferences about Arab apartheid. None of these things are lies, etc., etc. So I wasn't saying that we should lie. I said the topic of our campaign should be, they are liars.
It's an interesting phenomenon, and part of the issue is, I can give my experience from the context of David Horowitz, for example, had as a counterbalance to Israel apartheid, David Horowitz, who publishes Front Page Magazine, started a terrorism awareness week. So he came on campuses and gave examples of the pathologies of the Arab states and gender apartheid and mutilation and all kinds of things that are much worse than the supposed apartheid in Israel. And Muslim student groups and others went to the administrations of these universities and said he's an Islamophobe and he's anti-Muslim and he's hurting our feelings. And so he was banned from campuses. And we're going to go crazy if he comes. And if he managed to get onto a campus, he was shouted down, just like Michael Warren was at the University of California at Irvine. So the other side does not want our version of the truth, even our version of the lies, but does not want us to have a voice because they've decided that Israel has no moral right to even defend itself in the court of public opinion. It's a terrible problem because in telling the truth, we are considered to be uttering hate speech, not fact.
I was suspecting.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I felt like Charles was reading my mind, so I'll elaborate on what he said. First, I have to congratulate you, Dr. Cravatts, and the Hillel staff, and the volunteers and the activists who put together such a substantive panel with really important information, very well articulated.
Thanks, Mom.
I wouldn't be making a comment at a microphone if I didn't follow it. However, there is a huge difference between doing something and accomplishing something. And basically, here we are, let's say, responding to something that happened in this building. We're breathing the air that may have been expelled by the right of return people a week ago. But when you look around at the demographics of who's here, there are maybe a dozen people under the age of 30, not that many more under 60. And if you think down the line, 20 years from now, a lot of us won't even be on this planet, let alone holding teaching positions, voting, traveling, being activists. We need to do, we who are like-thinking people and who respect the truth about Israel, need to be reaching out to younger people in a way that the right of return people did. Their conference wasn't a cool intellectual presentation of the facts, as we do. We like to think like that. But if I didn't go, I wouldn't go, I was on Shabbos too, but if you looked at their website for weeks in advance, it was very exciting. There was home hospitality, it was 2 days, people came from all over the country. There was an energy and a youthfulness about it, an emotional side that we tend not to do. We think that the facts and the truth will stand for themselves, and the more we learn, the more powerful we are. But there's a gut level where we have to reach people, and we need to do it so that our young people are equipped, not just to respond, but as Charles said, to actively, preventatively spread the truth and develop a sense of peoplehood and Zionism. You know, Birthright does a great job, the post-birthright things that happen on campuses do a great job. But when it comes to doing something like very focused education about the so-called right of return, having all the facts and figures flash in front of us is wonderful. But there really needs to be more intensive education coupled with something that gets to people on an emotional gut level, and it has to happen as a way of building community and as an ongoing part of Jewish life. That's where they're succeeding and we're not. So again, I congratulate you on doing a wonderful job at what this is, but urge you to take your considerable talents and energy to work on something bigger. And the cameras that are here, I volunteer to help after 20 years working in the Jewish community. I really want to do that kind of event on an ongoing basis. Thank you very much.
I do have a question, but just to continue what Louise was saying, and this thought of it as an idea, you have the panel, it's all ready, you have a videotape, you have your presentations, you can just put it on tour. It doesn't have to be, it was amazing that we were here to counter the recent conference, because I feel as though our community does not get together and do so, and we're afraid of drawing too much attention, and we don't want to aggravate anyone, or paranoid of getting attacked. So thank you for putting this together, and now it's all ready to go, so why don't we just put it all over tour? We don't have to counter other conferences. We can do our own, which is pretty much what Charles has said and Louise said. So that's one statement. My question is for Mr. Yamini. You mentioned Derry and you said it was a massacre, but there's been much evidence that proves otherwise, that there wasn't exactly a massacre, that there were people killed, but the numbers were conflated, that there wasn't exactly 254 murders or deaths on the Arab side, and that also many people admitted that, and Arabs admitted, that the rumor of rape of the Arab women was false. It was to scare them of the Jews and to also help them flee. So, make them flee. So can you elaborate on that? Because that's something that comes up a lot. And as far as I'm aware, it's not. It's another lie. So I wanted you to just elaborate on that.
Can you be more specific about
Derry.
First of all, about the two last questions, something that I must say. The right of report is not the biggest lie. There are some lies that are even bigger. And many young students, you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Many young students are actually attracted to the language of human rights. And when young students, even from Hillel clubs, when they meet the students of JDP or other pro-Palestinian organizations, they are really attracted. They are not anti-Zionist. Of course, they are not anti-Semites. They are Jews themselves. But when they hear the lies again and again, 1,000 times, they begin to believe it. And the people like Abu Nima, that was mentioned here, Ali Abu Nima, and Omar Barghouti and others, they speak in the language of human rights. But what they say actually, and we must hear them, they say that we support the extermination of one state, a UN member. And people are clapping. And people say, wow, human rights. I mean, what they say is actually, we are against the existence, the very existence of one state. But they speak on behalf of human rights. There is, of course, a huge contradiction. I mean, you cannot speak about human rights and actually speaking about dissolving one state. And that's what they are doing, actually. Which is a big tragedy, but people, young students, and I saw them. I was in Berkeley, I was in Princeton, I was in Yale. People are attracted to the language of human rights. Not because they are anti-Zionist, because they are not equipped with information. They are misinformed, they are disinformed, they are ill-informed. And they are attracted. And there is not anybody, I mean, I'm coming from Israel, I mean, I'm here only for 1 year, it's a sabbatical year, but you have to do something. You have to do something about it. Because it's becoming a problem. I mean, I read people like, sorry to say, Peter Banner, who speak about the young generation. Even in his articles, and he defines himself as a Zionist, unfortunately, I find so many lies. He has no idea what he's talking about. Yes, he has one source. So to say, Haaretz newspaper. And when you read the Haaretz, what can you do? But you must be anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, if you read it again and again. I'm talking about the political sections, opinions. I mean, you have no other choice. And when you see his footnotes, it's art. And there is nobody to answer many times. So people are not basically anti-Zionist or anti-Israelist. They just don't know. Somebody must inform them. It's not simple. I have no idea how to do it. But they are attracted to the language of human rights, and we should speak about human rights. Sorry, we don't have the time. We did not speak. I did not come here to speak about the story of human rights. But this is the biggest lie, and I can show you in numbers how many people were killed in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict compared to any other conflict. Does Israel really kill civilians, innocent civilians during the casting operation and so on? People are lying because they don't know the proportions, they don't know the numbers, they don't know anything. They just don't know. And we have a problem. Now, the same is going with the past and with Bir Yassin. People know about Bir Yassin. I guess I will not be wrong if I would say that something like 99% of the young Israelis know about Bir Yassin, but they don't know about at least 15 massacres that took place in the Arab world against Jews. They just don't know. Even in Israel, nobody is teaching them. Nobody is telling them. Nobody is informing them. So they don't know. And many times the same kind of process that is taking place here is taking place also in Israel. The same kind of faculties that you have here, we have in Israel. With this kind of, sorry to say, I mean, but I guess some of you hear about it, the same kind of anti-Zionist professors, we do have it. I mentioned only one, Ilan Pappert. But there are many Ilan Pappert in Israel. And people are misinformed and disinformed, even in Israel, unfortunately. And all the movies that you saw, people don't explain it as, I mean, gatekeepers and others and fire-walking cameras. Some of you know what I'm talking about, but people don't know. People see, watch these movies and say, wow, what terrible Israel is. In Israel, when we produce it and when it is subsidized by the government, by the Israeli government, it is part of the democracy. I mean, when I'm giving lectures, I'm saying, well, if you show me an article of Haaretz, or if you're telling me something about the gatekeepers or about cameras, this is the best proof that Israel is a democracy. But it's not the common perception when they see. When they read the Haaretz, when they see the gatekeepers, when they watch fire-walking cameras, they think, well, Israel is a pariah state. Yes, we have a problem. We mean democracy, we mean the freedom of speech, but the outcome is the opposite. We have a problem, and we have to face it. I'm not sure that I have solutions. I mean, it's not a panel discussion about the solution of the Israeli Hasbara. I mean, I'm not dealing with Hasbara. I'm dealing with the industry of lies. And there is an industry of lies that we are facing. We have a problem.
The idea that you just brought up about the language of human rights is very critical on campuses particularly. The idea has been transmogrified into this concept of what they call social justice. So even Brandeis University has in its mission statement that it wants its students to address social justice. Students for justice in Palestine. What does that mean? It means justice for the Palestinians, not for the Jews. So social justice in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian debate, at least on campuses, but elsewhere in the human rights industry, involves the same mission statement that animates the Occupy movement. That there are people that have stuff, and there are people that don't, and the people that don't are going to take it at the expense of the people that have it. And in the case of Israel, it means social justice for the Palestinians at the expense of Israel. That the existence of two states living side by side is not on the agenda of the people's state with social justice. When I was at AIPAC, there was the normal group of protesters outside, and they were jumping up and down at one point saying, "Intifada, Intifada, long live Intifada." And think about that. And in Copley Square, after the last Gaza incursion, there was a group holding a banner that says, "Jews for Intifada." Beyond Orwellian. But what is that saying? It says it's worth it in the name of social justice to murder Jews for the sake of the Palestinian cause. There's something wrong with it. That's the world turned upside down. Social justice is not just if it only helps one person at the expense of the other, particularly when you're calling for the murder of those other people.
Yeah, 2 comments and then a question. Israel, unfortunately, has lost the narrative war. That's the reality of American campuses. The second comment I'd make is it would have to be done in a sophisticated way. If Jewish students don't learn from Benny Morris when they're in high school, what they're going to confront in college is Yuan Papet without Benny Morris, then they're going to be lost. In other words, what I'm suggesting is there has to be a more sophisticated education about Israel than exists now in Jewish schools and among Jewish youth. It's not simply a one-sided narrative, so that when they take the relevant courses in college, they can answer the professor and say, but that was in the context of war, that's not, or Papet is taking a sentence from a decade before and using it to illustrate something else. I have a substantive question, given the fact that I think we have an expert here. Is there any, I know Joan Peters, for her time in Memorial, was criticized tremendously, but is there some validity to her thesis that at least the Arab population of Palestine, particularly in the 20th century, is partly the result of the economic progress of Zionism, so that other Arabs were attracted either from Egypt or from adjoining Arab countries? And a correlative question of that is, to what extent did the so-called permanent population of Palestine also have relatives on the other side of the river, so that when we're talking about Palestinians, in fact, in truth, they were also what later became Jordanians, but not simply as a matter of refugees, but because they were relatives of these tribes and people on both sides of the river.
Did you get the essence of the question?
The Joan Peters book has been, it's a book called From Time Immemorial, which came out about 20, 30 years ago, which tried to show that not that many Palestinians actually became refugees, because many of the people who had, many of these Arabs who left their homes in 1948 weren't really long-standing inhabitants of Palestine, but were recent comers. And therefore they were just like the Jews, new immigrants to the place, and therefore if they were displaced, they weren't really Palestinians. That was the argument. Most critics of the book, as most people who read the book and knew something about the history, like Yoshua Porat, Professor Emeritus in Jerusalem, thought that she had misused sources and misused them deliberately and badly. And her picture of Palestine before Zionism and the first decades of Zionism wasn't an accurate picture. What it means, what the bottom line of what I'm saying is that most of the Palestinians who lived in Palestine in 1947-48 were genuine Palestinians. Some of them had come recently. Some of them came in the 1920s and 30s, perhaps attracted by progress which was brought by the Zionists, but mainly progress which was brought by the British and even the Ottoman Turks before the 1900s. Small numbers of foreigners actually entered Palestine in the 20s and 30s and 40s legally, and probably small numbers who also entered illegally. Now let me add just one small comment to that. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman government did navigate, did direct, channel people from certain areas to come to Palestine. Small numbers of Bosnians. So in 1948, there were a number of Bosnian villages in Palestine. Small numbers of Kurds. That's why there were Kurdish villages in Palestine. Small numbers of Egyptians coming from Muhammad Ali's domain in the 1830s, 1840s. So there were 2 villages in Palestine in 1947 called El Misr, which means Egypt. But these are small numbers compared to the native Palestinian Arab population, which in 1948 was essentially a result of procreation, of Palestinians giving birth to more Palestinians. That's the answer to that. One other thing you talked about, it's probably true, some of the Palestinians had relatives. The Palestinians before 48 had originated, had come to Palestine also from across the river, either from the Golan or Syria or from Jordan. One famous family, which I know of, came from Irbid in Jordan, the Tabaris, and became the most important Palestinian family in Tiberias, the town of Tiberias. The leadership family was called the Tabaris. When 1948 happened, they fled back to Irbid. They moved back to Irbid. So they came there a couple of hundred years before and moved back. But this is fairly unusual. There weren't that many families like that.
Okay, I'll make this quick. Thank you guys so much for coming. It was awesome to hear you guys. I know you're exhausted. So I went to a Jewish high school, and I talked to my friends across the country at other colleges about other events like the conference that just happened last weekend. And we were Skyping this weekend, and something we all noticed was a lot of the people participating in these events are not Palestinian or Arab related, but more not to be racist, but white Americans. And so I wanted to know all of your thoughts about why you think non-Palestinian people are getting so involved and so passionate about this issue, and why are they so uneducated and they're not open to listening to the other side.
That really ties into Richard's point, to Ben Gore's point about the issue of the language of human rights. I mean, the perception on North American college campuses and college campuses is a liberal environment. So everybody was looking for kind of a John Lennon environment, no religion, no boundaries, and the fact that we can all get along. Further, it goes into the issue of the narrative. I mean, you're talking about, when you teach history, almost, or a story, you look about historical anchors, you talk about environments, you talk about Jewish history, you talk about Holocaust, 67, 76, as far as Entebbe and whatnot. The generation that, your generation that is now on college campuses is a generation that, the entering freshman class was born in 1995, 1996, so the towers fell, you're 6, 7 years old, around, so talking about, what happened, and then it's harder to look for historical anchors when you don't remember what happened, kind of the narrative, and the narrative goes that the younger generation that is brought up today on college campuses are brought up in an environment where Israel is in the wrong. They don't remember a time when Israel was in the right. They don't remember when Israel did not exist. So to make the argument, that here we are since the 6-Day War, if you kind of pull, American polls as far as look at Time and Life magazine, where in the aftermath of the 6-Day War, you saw Israelis only swimming in the Suez Canal and how cool it was to be Israeli. And over the past 40-some years, it is a given where Israel is in the wrong and the Palestinians are the David and we're the Goliath. So that explains part of that narrative. And so when you talk about why there are American Jews who support the idea of Jews for the occupation and whatnot, that's part of looking, trying to seek out the narrative of what it means for me to be a liberal Zionist, even at a point where I become anti-Israel. And that's, again, there's a whole psychology. We're talking about people like Peter Beinart and others, and even Jason to a lot of extent. And you talk about, groups that even Ben Gore mentioned. There's another group, obviously, I'm sure you're aware of, Breaking the Silence, and the Shministim were going around. They represent a fringe minority within Israeli society. In the Israeli environment, yes, they are representing a democracy, but they really are not indicative of a larger population and how people feel about that. And so that's part of our challenge. And so the win back of the debate, the gentleman's question here,
you look at area studies in North America, you look at, Middle East studies and Israel studies in North America, they have been hijacked by the Arab narrative. Not to mention the fact that there have been poured Saudi money to teach this narrative, and you're talking about Title VI centers. They're getting federally funded money to teach. They're anti-American with federal dollars. I mean, this is a problem, and so all of us who teach and are in and out of academia, part of our main criticism is not about whether or not you want to study the Palestinian narrative or not, but the fact that they're only studying the Palestinian narrative. There's a lack of balance. Nobody knows about the other side. If you poll, you look at more, I've looked at this over the years, more students are looking just at Edward Said's Orientalism and not looking at the critique of that. I mean, just to give you an example of how pervasive it is within academia. And that's what we should be doing. We should be first asking for a basic balance that is seriously lacking in our schools.
Can I add one sentence about something specific? You mentioned the business of David and Goliath, and my suggestion, I'm not in propaganda, but I am into history, I would suggest that anybody who talks about that, the response should be the conflict isn't really between Israel and the Palestinians, and Israel is a Goliath in relation to the Palestinians, but between Israel and the Arab world, and if you like, even the greater Muslim world. And in that conflict, Israel definitely is a David. And that's really how the conflict...
To show you the depth of the problem, though, there's 240 Israel apartheid weeks in March going on around the world. As I told you, there's no apartheid in Israel. Yet these events take place. They last for a week. Student after student, activist after activist gets up. They construct an apartheid wall. They tell about the sins of Israel. And students going by believe it because why wouldn't they? How could people be saying this on 240 campuses if it wasn't partially true?
Mainly, but they always have some Israelis coming to say that Israel is an apartheid state.
Yeah, but they're racists trying to defend an indefensible problem. And we were talking the other day about willful blindness on the part of morally upright students and others who feel that they're helping the underdog. I don't blame people for being attracted to the idea of helping people, but they're doing it in a context of lies and contortions, which is the problem. Go ahead, sir.
Quick comment. Great conference, lots of good information, lots of good suggestions. I don't think it'll be picked up. Childhood suggestion, Louise. I have a suggestion regarding the Jews who go around screaming Jews for Intifada and so forth and so on. I believe in controlled violence. You're going to hear the Jewish Defense League. Regrettably, it's out of business. ADL and others, the Reformed Jews, put it out of business. Regrettably, I'm not a spokesman for it, but I just want to plant that seed. That sometimes in a multi-front war, you cannot just have, it's not just a matter of educating the kids and making them feel good and home hospitality, all these things have their place. But sometimes you need, seriously, and this is not the forum for it, I'm sure. And I say, I just want to throw the idea out that, heck, if there was a JDL kind of demonstration vis-a-vis those characters at the APEC conference you mentioned, and other such, okay? Yeah, there would have been some screaming and yelling, and the police would have been involved. You know something? It would have been an answer, maybe a short-term answer, maybe not a solution, but it would have been a help. And we would have raised that, we would put our head a little higher than always being down and saying, oh my God, what are we going to do now? Look at our own people are turning against us. I just throw that out as an idea.
Are you saying we'll make them an offer they can't refuse?
I have a question and I have a quick comment. There was a question about what do we do about young people and their disengagement with Israel and with being Jewish. And I think that part of the problem is that they're not disengaged with being Jewish or with Israel, but they're disengaged with doing so with confidence. And they have been trained to believe that being politically correct and looking at the other side and making sure everything is 50-50 and 100% balanced is the right way to go. And I think that it's crucial that we start to train our young people to be completely strong, confident Zionists, not just because they're Jewish, but because being a Zionist is being moral and being right. And I think that that's part of the problem. We're so used to being the underdog that sometimes we feel like if we're not the underdog, we're not who we are. And that's no longer true because we have Israel. So anyway, but my question is, in that regard, it's so difficult to get students to speak up against professors like Mossad and his buddy Rashid Khalidi, both at Columbia, and people like Julio Pino at Kent State. Why are these I don't know, why are these professors still teaching? It's so obvious and so demonstrable that they have a history of not only obscuring the facts, but of lying and of being aggressive towards students who disagree with them. How do we get them out of our schools? I don't know.
The short answer is we can't. Those two that you mentioned are in the Middle Eastern Studies Department at Columbia, which is infested and ruled by people with like sentiments. So academic departments are headed by people who have a particular philosophy and ideology, and they hire professors to serve in those departments who think like they do, particularly in a highly charged Department of Middle Eastern Studies. The other problem, and this is something that Scholars for Peace in the Middle East confronts all the time, is that when we approach universities to point out some of the vagaries of some of their professors and some of the missteps and some of the what you would consider to be unacceptable intellectual behavior, they use what my colleague Ken Marcus calls First Amendment opportunism by saying, well, we have academic freedom here and we can't tell people what to think. And in fact, the university should not be firing people for thinking certain views. The problem is that there's a lack of balance. The problem is also that student groups on campus who rail against Israel or white people or Christians or other non-protected groups can say just about anything that they want, but other people who come and criticize Muslim students, Hispanic students, gay students, and other protected minority groups and victim groups are usually thrown off campus, silenced, or censored for their behavior. So there's a huge double standard. It isn't possible, first of all, faculty who are tenured can't be fired just because they said something that the administration or other people don't like. What we can do as donors to universities and supporters of universities, if you are one, where something is going on, is to remind them that they're doing something that you don't like and you're going to withdraw your support. You're not going to send your kids there. You're not going to give annual alumni gifts and so forth. It's a very difficult problem because universities have to be free to have expressions from all sides. The danger is when only a certain view is allowed to be heard, which is very often the case in Middle Eastern Studies departments, but also in sociology departments, English departments, the humanities. Do you know that they've done studies of whether a professor is leaning towards being a self-described Democrat or a self-described Republican, a liberal or conservative? In departments of sociology, anthropology, and the social sciences, the ratio of Democrats to Republicans or liberals to conservatives is 35 to 1. In other words, there's no conservative thought. And conservatives, I just saw a poll, conservatives and Republicans have historically and continue to be stronger supporters of Israel because they don't see Israel as a predatory, oppressive nation. They see them as a continuing victim. And they don't see the Palestinians as innocent victims as they are described in the language of human rights. By the way, this student that are standing now, and Aviva in the background, unbelievably valiant, courageous defenders of Israel on an ongoing, weekly basis. When I was their age, I was throwing beer cans at policemen and smoking a bong. And I mean, it gives me great prospects that something can happen good, that there can be a change. And believe me, it is not easy to stand up to a professor like Mossad, because you're a student and they have enormous power over you, even if you're right. Even if you're right. And as Charles knows from the movie Columbia Unbecoming, those professors speak to their students in a way that we would find totally abhorrent and irresponsible.
My name is Arthur. I go to school across the Fenway at Northeastern. And I found tonight's conference on a personal level to be really interesting. I'm really glad it came. I learned a lot. But when we hold pro-Israel events on my campus, I measure the success of the event based off of whether or not we're preaching to the choir. And I think, our group is Huskies for Israel, the activities of Huskies for Israel in Northeastern Hillel. If you go back over the past couple of years, a lot of the pro-Israel events were reactionary, reacting to what the Students for Justice in Palestine were doing. And when you decompose that student group, at least at my campus, there's 3 different types of students. There are Arab international students who have come to Boston to study, and then there's Jewish so-called liberal students, and then there's regular white students who are the disciples of the anti-Israel professors in the Political Science and International Affairs Department. And just this past week, we had a proactive event where we had IDF soldiers come to campus on Yom HaShoah. And the Students for Justice in Palestine, for one of the first times, was reactionary. And they staged a protest. There was an article about it in the student newspaper. They looked like fools. It went viral on the internet. So my question really is, how do you make Israel the liberal cause again? And how do you prevent preaching to the choir in terms of Hazara on campus?
Maybe something. I go to a lot of universities. And sometimes I do speak to elect clubs. And I don't think that what I'm doing is preaching to the choir. I'll tell you why. Because most people, even in Hillel, don't know the basic facts. And what happened, for example, in Berkeley, just 2 years ago, that the 2 students that represented the BDS in the, I don't know how it's called, the Council of Students or something like that, they were 2 students from Hillel. Because, as I said before, they were attracted to the language of human rights, and they became part of the JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, and they were the supporters of the BDS. Now, the problem is that they don't know. They are not anti-Israelis. They just didn't know what to answer. And the pro-Palestinian groups, as you all know, are much more active. And when you hear again and again, every year, you have a week of the apartheid Israel. They don't know. They just have no idea because they hear so many lectures against Israel and they just don't have any idea. I'll give you an example why it is not to preach to the choir. Because just a year ago, I was in the same university in the apartheid week. And of course, I was challenged with the question of course, I will not give false lecture. I'll give you just an example. They had no clue about it. You know, Moshe Katsav was the president of Israel. And he was sent to jail to 7 years. I'm not proud about it, but this is not the story. The story is that he had 3 judges. The presiding judge out of the 3 was an Israeli Arab. Now, why I'm saying it? First of all, because out of the 60 Jewish students, no one knew about it. You have to equip them with the information. Now, when they went out the day after to the apartheid week, they had something to say. Apartheid state, what are you talking about? And of course, I can give you now so many examples and numbers and statistics to refute the story the bloodline of the apartheid state. So it is not to preach to the choir, because many times the choirs that we are speaking about, they don't know the basic facts even then, when they are pro-Israelis. So we need them. We need them as soldiers, we need them as people of, not because they are Jews, just because we have the truth with us. And we have to remember it, not because we are Israelis, not because we are Jews, not because we are Zionists, because we are speaking on behalf of liberal values. We speak on behalf of them and not them, because they are speaking about only one thing, the destruction of one state. Thank you.
I think the issue I want to bring is I think that the education needs to be started from the Jews. If we can educate our fellow Jews, we can then educate the rest of the world, like being at work and explaining. My son was recently he studied in high school. He was recently exposed to distorted Israeli history and the whole conflict. And I investigated. I went to the school and looked at the material and have a copy of all the curriculum. And clearly there was anti-Israeli curriculum in form of misinformation and lack of information, just like now my wife and I brought that issue to the temple, and I was really surprised to find out that the temple doesn't want to get involved in confronting the school committee. I mean, the temple clearly took a position that they are not going to get involved in this. And by the temple doesn't take position, we're not helping the cause of getting the information correct.
Was this the Arab Studies notebook?
No, it was not the Arab Studies notebook. Particularly, it was just actually we went to talk to the teacher and to the head of the history department, and the way they got the curriculum is by Google information, and whatever they found, like for example, they gave information and the Khartoum declaration, or it was 1968, 67, was completely omitted. So here the students think that Israel doesn't want peace, where the teacher never taught them that there were 3 no's after the 67 war. And this is just like one example of how misinformation was there. But really, the fact that the temple refused to take position, I think this is what we should be disturbed with, that we are not helping ourselves by not confronting this misinformation. Because there's limited thing that I can do of telling the teachers that what the teachers is wrong. Actually, I want to ask the panel about something. Israel controlled the West Bank and Gaza Strip for a very long time. Why didn't they take some steps to dismantle the refugee camps in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip?
We did. As I mentioned, I mean, there were very proposals in 1969 and even before that. I mean, the problem is, if you look at UNRWA, you look at the larger Palestinian narrative, as far as everybody's a refugee. And so it becomes part and parcel of the larger rejectionist ideology. I mean, Betty's point should be well taken as far as David and Goliath, as far as how the Arab Muslim world sees really the Jewish as an anathema to the larger, to the Middle East at large. And that's why you have all these problems.
but there have been ongoing attempts. I mean, this is part of that kind of dissonance that I was talking about as far as the perception of who is a refugee and the perception in the West of a fleeing individual that is stateless and whatnot. And when you look at the reality on the ground, that's not the case. But there has been, an ongoing attempt and really an ongoing selling of this agenda by the Arab world and by the West by funding UNRWA and by funding the idea that we are refugees. And this is all part of it. A better example for you. According to UNRWA's accounting, based on who is a refugee, even Arab Israelis are refugees. I mean, so they make the case. I mean, so there is that back and forth. And if you ask Palestinians, if you interview, and I've been in the camp, and you have these interviews, they will tell you practically they will most likely not believe in an actual right of return, but they will believe in monetary compensation. So they hold on to a whole, whether or not it's a shack or something, the identity card, the keys, the Nakba narrative, all of that is part of a larger issue to aggrandize what a Palestinian is, who he is. And this is part of it. But there have been ongoing attempts to assimilate, reintegrate. Again, we don't talk about that. That's part of the lack of balance, and that's part of what we've been talking about, even as far as American foreign policy, as far as trying to reintegrate, reassimilate. Those are all the things that we did attempt to do, but there was a lot of pushback from the Arab world, from Palestinians themselves. That's part of the history that is not known.
Can I just answer what you asked? Israel didn't try to dismantle the refugee camps. It could be it was a very bad mistake, and it didn't make an effort, but it simply didn't. There may have been some talk about it occasionally. There was one Knesset member who was famous who did talk about it, proposed it to the government, but he didn't actually get anywhere. It involves a lot of money, and it could be that also there was a resistance on the part of UNRWA and the refugees themselves who didn't want them dismantled. But essentially, the Israeli government didn't want to touch the subject. It cost too much, and it was too complicated. That's the real answer.
They also believed it would disappear. Again, they also was a temporary issue. That's all part of that.
Because if you go to the West Bank and you look at it's very symbolic. I mean, we used to say it looks like there are matches, packs of matches. Like it has unique characteristics to it and very symbolic. Find a way to make cities out of it would be better.
Okay.
This will be our last question, unfortunately, because we're out of time.
Okay, so I work for the independent student newspaper here, and personally seeing the article written in the paper, like completely unaware it was even being covered, the conference on Students for Justice in Palestine, and seeing it on the homepage and being really uncomfortable. In the morning I couldn't even read the whole article, and then later that day I just took time to try and understand what they were saying. And all this talk about trying with balance and trying to educate people who just aren't trying to understand. For anyone, I mean, I know you, based on your bio, you worked in so many different publications. How could we either balance out the misunderstanding or just, I don't know, try and educate people, kind of right the wrongs and just give people a better understanding within publications without seeming unbalanced? I don't know.
You're asking me?
Yeah.
I don't have answers. I just know about history.
Okay.
Well, you can write articles, you can learn the history, you can try and tell the truth about what happened. That's what you should really be doing. But this is it doesn't reach that many people. And probably somebody has suggested a strategy, a preemptive strategy of attacking the other side and his lies, not reacting to everything. This is probably a right approach. It sounds like the right approach, because just responding doesn't seem to work. But I have a feeling that the international environment and the state of morals in the world make responding to this type of lying campaign objectively very difficult. So it's very difficult to overcome.
Thank you all for your time and